Now, this whole thing of the Shroud of Turin, if you're not familiar with it, let me just give you a real brief breakdown of it. I want to put up some images here, and we're going to look at what the text has to say and compare it to the images that I'm going to show you. So if we know what it is, you can read about it. Just do a simple internet search of it, and you can hear about the origins of it. And there's a lot of intrigue about where did it come from, and there's differing opinions on it. But Shroud of Turin is something that's very easy to read the backstory on it and read numbers of sources, because you want to try to weed through any one particular group's kind of preconceived notions about it. But what you can get is that there is this image, and it's on one big long piece of cloth, and as the story goes, it was what Jesus was actually wrapped in. So it has his back and his front, and it has the features of his face, and you can see pictures. I'm going to show you some pictures of it. So the belief is, and it's now a relic among the Catholics and the Orthodox, and so this is something that people will come, there's pilgrimages to see it, and it's something that has just been intrigued, but it again is put out there as being the burial cloth of Jesus. And then you can get into all the reasons why. Well, why is the image there? It looks like what you would see as a negative in a film. So it's like the impression of a face and all the rest of it. Okay, great. So that's where there's all the debate among the scientists. And as they've started to take scientific looks at the actual cloth and the things that are in it, they have found pollens and basic things from that part of the world, like from the Middle East, and DNA and all that kind of stuff. There's many samples of DNA because it's been handled by so many people over the years. So anyway, all that's fine. People love to debate it. There's all the quote science behind it, and one group says it's authentic, another says that it's a fabrication, and all the rest of it. So let them argue the whole thing. I'm not really one of those people that likes to argue much about it. I just don't think that it measures up to what I see in the text, and that's the bigger issue. So what I would like to be able to do is to take a look at a few of the images, because I think that they're kind of telling and they're a little bit helpful to us. So there are a number of passages that we can look at that should give us an understanding of what we might see if there was some kind of an impression that was left if Jesus was actually wrapped in something. What might we expect to see? And that would be a good indication of whether or not this whole thing is authentic. So let me bring up the first of the images, and this is the actual shroud itself. And this is the body from the front and from the back. And I want to make a couple of observations. So let me bring that up right now, and we'll take a look at that. Okay, so our first image here that I want to point to is the body itself, and this is all one piece. Okay, so the way that it's presented and laid out is the head touches, like you got the back and the front that touches, and it's folded over like it's one piece. Let's say it was laid on a slab, and the sheet was there, or this linen was there. The body would have been put in place. They put the hands where they are, and then they fold it over the top. So there is the body that lays on the front and back. As you look towards the left, you're going to see that there are a lot of marks. And so there's marks along the, what would be the back of the thigh, the calves, and certainly up around the back there. So you can see a lot of places where there are stripes, or where there are abrasions from what would be the scourging or the whipping. So that's the first part that I really want to deal with. Now, here's one of the things that's kind of interesting. There are some things that get repeated so often that we just believe them. And the first one is that Jesus was scourged 39 times. And so we get that that happened to Paul. It was Paul who was scourged the 39 times, and they didn't do the 40th because that would have been unlawful for him to be scourged that way. But this was done by the Romans. So the idea that it was some number, how many ever times it was, in this impression here, it would have been a number of times that he would have been struck. And this one here gives the impression that he was struck on the back of the legs down to the calves and pretty much all along the back of him. So that's what you see in this image here. Now, this is one of the first places that I really do kind of struggle with my understanding of this, because there's there's an interesting thing that I think gets missed, and let me bring that up now, because we have a good idea, basically because it was the Romans, what kind of a scourging instrument they might use. So what you see here is what they would call their scourge. The Romans would call it a flagrum or flagrum, however you'd say it. But this is something that they would use. We've heard it referred to as a cat of nine tails as well. It's a type of a whip that was there, but this we do know. This, from all historical accounts, this would be something that you're not just trying to leave an impression on someone's back. Like what we saw in that picture, yeah, you can see that there were impressions that were left, but depending on how many times he was struck, which that picture that's on the image there would certainly give the impression in the Shroud of Turin that he was struck a number of times, if this is actually him. But if they're using this, and as you're looking at that, you want to understand what's there. And if you look up this whip and do an image search through the internet, you'll see a lot of different versions of it. But what we do know from what was told about us, that they would put on the strips of the leather, they would embed it with things like bone and things like with metal. But it was intended to not just leave a strip, or not to just leave a mark like you might get if you had a whip on your back. It wasn't just meant to leave a cut. This would remove an enormous amount of skin and everything that would be on the back. But if you were to go ahead and reach your back there and reach around to the back of your body and just touch the back there, you'd realize that your ribs are just under the surface of your skin, and there's not a lot that's between the bone and the actual what's under the skin. So there's not a lot that's there. So it would be very easy. You can feel your spine as well. It wouldn't take much if it's being torn to get right to the idea of bone. And if you're using one of these and that's being laid to your back as you're pulling it away, what would happen is if you're hitting somebody with this, it would embed into the skin. And as you pull it away, it would tear the skin. So after a number of times, depending on how many times he would have been struck, and according to what you saw there in the shroud, it was a number of times that he would have been struck, if we use that as our understanding. But if he was struck that many times, it would have done a whole lot more damage than what you see on the shroud. More than likely, you would start to see the outline of bone if that was the case. Because I would think that if he was struck a number of times in the back with this or one like it, again, we're talking about bone and metal, and some would even say glass, but things that were not intended to just leave an impression. It was meant to rip skin and rip actual flesh off of the body. So it doesn't take much on the back to start to remove so much of it that you're exposing bone and maybe even spine. So I don't see that on the shroud. That doesn't seem to fit very well from what I see. Now, we get that from John, that he was scourged that way. Now, as we come around to the front of the image of what we see for the face and the rest of it, it's bad enough what we've just looked at so far, and comparing what this kind of a weapon or this kind of a whip would do to skin, it looks different than what we would see in the shroud. But I want to point this out on the front, which to me is also very, very important. So what you see here is the face. And when we look at it, you can see that there is the little white marks around the brow, and that the little white marks, again, since this is a negative taken of it. This is from a photograph that was taken of the actual shroud itself, and then it was a negative of that picture. That's why it looks different. When you look at the actual shroud, it's kind of a brownish colored linen, and there is, the browner, darker relief of the face. This would be an image that from a photograph turned into a negative. That's what we're able to see, which gives you a lot more definition. So what you see there is really right up over the left eyebrow. You see that white, looks like a number 3, and then a mark underneath it. And there are a couple more that are like that. Now, once again, if we understand what a head wound would look like, there are a few different possibilities of what might have been used for this crown of thorns. Now, some would look at it that it was more of a like a helmet type of a thing, and I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, because if you're trying to make it a crown and you're trying to mock him as a king, you would make it more of a wreath kind of a thing. There are a couple of different candidates that you have for what they could have made this crown out of, but it's a crown of thorns, and it said they twisted it upon his head. So again, the question simply would be, if that was the case, and we all know how head wounds are, you bleed profusely. And some of these thorns, if it's the one particular bush, or even if it's a date palm, some of the thorns on these things are 2 to 3 inches long. And if you're making an entire one of those and you're twisting it on his head, you're going to have more than just a couple of little impressions, and they're going to bleed profusely. But this looks pretty benign. Now, more importantly than that, and I want to look at a couple of passages here, but I look at the definitions that are there. I can see his mouth, I can see his nose, you can see the cheekbones, you can see the eyelids, you can see the eyebrow, you can see the forehead. And it really looks very distinct. It doesn't look in any way disfigured. And so when I read, again, the text, I have a little bit of a problem with that because of what I read in Isaiah. Let's start there. We're going to go to Isaiah chapter 52. And let's remember, again, as we're already studying Isaiah, it's a scroll. So what we have at the end of chapter 52 runs into chapter 53. Chapter 53 is what you would expect of a crucifixion, and the person that is being described here in 53, it really only fits one person, and that would be Jesus. Now, the Jewish person would tell you, no, it's speaking about the nation of Israel. Well, clearly, when you read the internals of the chapter, it's speaking about a person. And when you see what happened to Jesus, he fits this identically. But look at what we see in chapter 52, starting at verse 13. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. And this is God speaking about the one that he would send. So clearly not the nation. This is a servant that would be sent. And it says, he will be exalted and he will be extolled and very high. Now that eventually will be the case, but he's going to go through what we're reading in chapters 53 and the end of chapter 52 to begin with. Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage, that means his image, what people would see of him, that it was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. And it tells us earlier in the chapter that they ripped out this person's beard. And so even the facial hair that would have been there, he being a rabbi would have had a beard, and they ripped it out from him. But when you look at this image, it doesn't look like that's the case. But this is what's important. Just as any were astonished at you, speaking of Jesus, so his visage was marred more than any man. So what we're about to read in chapter 53, this is giving a look before that. And when he goes through all of this and the ending result of it, he's so disfigured. When you see marred, think disfigured. And in fact, it's only used twice in the New Testament. The other time, or the Old Testament, this word marred, it's here, and then it's also in Leviticus where it talks about the nations being corrupted. That's marred. So what they're saying is that his visage, what you would see of him, his image, was marred. It was corrupted. And it was so like disfigured that basically it tells us the violence that was done to him would have had an impression. It would have left an impression. We are told that they struck him, put a bag over his head, and they struck him, and they did all of these violent things to him. The kind of trauma that would have happened to him from the whipping and all the rest would have started to make the face, make the rest of the body would start to look like it had been beat. But again, the face would certainly have been beaten. It was slapped, it was punched, it was hit, and who knows what else from the things that we have. And then the beating of him on the back would have caused swelling. It would have been, he would have been hardly recognizable. So with that in mind, we read the rest, his form more than the sons of men, and so shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths at him, for what had not been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall consider. But the important part of that is it gives us a description about what ends up happening to him in the process, that we read more about him, the crucifixion. Compare this with what you also read in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, and realize what happens when he goes through all of that. What kind of an effect would it actually have on him physically We get that at the end of chapter 52 of Isaiah. Now, let's move on to the Gospel of John, chapter 19. So John 19 adds some more detail that's very, very critical to our understanding of this. And in verse 4, we get this. Pilate then went out again, and he said to the people, let's actually start at verse 1. So Pilate took Jesus, and he scourged him. Now, the scourging would be that whipping of the back. And what else happened to him? Remember, as we read the other Gospels, they're mocking Jesus, put a bag over his head, punching him in the face and saying, prophesy or tell us who it was that struck you. And it sounds like it was more than just once. They were making sport of it. So when you read all the Gospels together and find out the violence that was done to him, it's important, and I will get to that in just a moment. So, scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe, and then they said, Hail, King of the Jews, and they struck him with their hands. So, struck him, I don't think it's like slapping him on the shoulder or on the back, it's the face. Of course, they're mocking him. So, it says, Pilate then went out again, and he said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, Behold the man. It's basically a way of saying, isn't this enough? Look at him. And that's to draw attention to how badly, if we take in what Isaiah had said, how badly disfigured he would have been. And it helps us, I think, a little bit to understand that, again, if the shroud was an authentic piece, would I expect him to look so peaceful and serene with just a little few drops of blood on the forehead, considering all that would have happened to him? I would expect to see a face that's disfigured and swollen and puffed up and not having features so prominent. So I have a problem with this from just that, from the description of what happened to him and the violence done to him. I don't expect to see him in very good shape like this is. He looks very good here. The face of this imprint looks very, very good. Now, as we read on a little bit further, here's, to me, what I think is very... to me, it's obvious that what we're looking at is not a genuine, the genuine burial cloth of Jesus. Now, I know what the other Gospels say about this as being a linen, and some people are able to look at that and say, see, it was a one piece. Well, John already knows what was said, but John was one of the two people who wrote a Gospel who were there and they saw first what was there. So let's remember, of the two people who went into the tomb and saw what was left, we get this from John, one of the two people, he and Peter. Now, Peter, they say, influenced the writing of the Gospel of John, but John is, of the Gospel, rather, of Mark. Peter was the one who gave details to Mark. In this case, we are reading the first-hand account of the man who went in, after Peter, of course, but nonetheless, he was there, and he's giving you his eyewitness account of what he personally saw. And he's giving you this detail 60 years after the fact, knowing what everybody else had already said. And this is what the Holy Spirit leaned upon him to do and to say. Now look at what we read. So after this, verse 38, Joseph of Arimathea, Jesus has already yielded up his ghost or his spirit. He's died. And it says, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission, and so he came and he took the body of Jesus. So also with him, Nicodemus, yes, that Nicodemus of chapter 3, who also came to Jesus by night, that's how we know which one it is, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. Now they did this hastily because it was the Sabbath. So they wanted to begin the process, and of course the ladies were going to come back at a later time and make it a proper burial. We know that from the resurrection day accounts that we read in the Gospels. So they took the body of Jesus, they bound it in strips, plural, of linen with spices, as was the custom of the Jews to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. I will probably do this as well. Not in this, but we'll probably look at the two possibilities of where the tomb might be and give you kind of an idea of that, but we'll do that at a different time. What we want to deal with here is how he was wrapped. Now, this makes it a case of being a series of linens, plural, in strip form. So not one long continuous piece, but the body was wrapped in strips of linen, a number of them. So, and then it tells us as we go on a little bit further, when we get to chapter 20, this is what happens on the date of resurrection. And so that's when we find, now on the first day of the week, that would be a Sunday morning. On that day, Mary Magdalene came and she went to the tomb early while it was still dark, and she's the one who saw this. Now, of course, she goes back and gives the details. So it says that she ran and she came to Peter, Simon Peter, and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, John, speaking of himself. And she said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Now, they're going there expecting to see something, and they want to get there and put it all together. Now, some people see an importance to the idea that if somebody tried to take his body to make it look like he resurrected, what they would have found when they were there kind of argues against that. You'll see it here in just a second. So Peter therefore went out, and the other disciple, and were going towards the tomb, and so they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. Now, of course, this is kind of funny. It is comical. John's giving you his firsthand account and says, I outran Peter. Well, John, you weren't the first one to go in. Peter wanted to be there first, so they both have bragging rights. Verse 5. So he, stooping down, looked in, and he saw the linen cloths, plural, lying there, yet he did not go in. This is John giving his firsthand account. I looked in, and I saw the strips of linen on the ground, not a whole cloth, the strips of linen. I saw the stuff that they had wrapped him in, Nicodemus and Joseph, and they're laying on the ground. That means that the body, whatever was on the body, was removed, strips, numerous ones, laying on the ground. And it says this, then Simon Peter came following him, and he went into the tomb, and he saw the linen cloths lying there, and in addition to that, the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in one place by itself, which is another way of just saying carefully was removed and put down, separate from the rest of the linen. So there was two pieces that were here. There was the part that was for the head, but then there were all these linen strips, and they were laid on the ground. So not one continual piece, because again, this would be a person who is disfigured according to Isaiah and to what we read from Pilate, just saying, look at him, behold the man. So what I look at in the shroud doesn't match John's account here, let alone matching the account of what would have happened to a person who had been incredibly brutalized. But we look at the Shroud of Turin, and he looks very well preserved with just a few little blood stains from what would have been a gushing head wound. So we read this, then the other disciple who came to the tomb first went in, and he saw, and then he believed. This is John saying, when did I actually really fully believe? Well, I'll tell you. It was seeing him as the resurrected. So with all of that said, looking at what we have taken from the text and from some of these images, I just think it's very, very important that we recognize that things can be presented to us, but we really should take a look at what the text has to say to give us a better understanding. So let me bring these images down. And what do we conclude from all of this? So the simple answer to that, for me, when people say, well, what about the scientific stuff? What about the idea that to leave that impression, it required something of just incredible intensity, and all the scientific evidences that they give for that? And so I would look at it like this. If it really is something that has all of that, there's no good scientific, or there's no good explanation other than something that, because of what science tells us, that it's something supernatural and miraculous, I'll concede that. I don't have a problem with that. It doesn't mean that I believe that it's of God, because I know that the devil knows how to play parlor tricks. He was doing it with the Egyptians when they stood before Pharaoh. When Moses stood before Pharaoh, threw down the staff, and it turned into a snake. You had the same with the sorcerers who could do it. We know that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that the devil is capable of all kinds of signs and lying wonders. And so one of the reasons why this wouldn't surprise me if it does have some kind of a supernatural origin, look at what people do with it. Take a look again as a Google or however you do your internet searches. Take a look at what people do with this now. There are people who include the Shroud of Turin in their prayers, and it is a thing of devotion to some people, and it's an object for what they do in their prayer, and they believe that it has supernatural healing properties as well. It's a distraction. And so as far as this is concerned, do I think relics are put out there and maybe even have a supernatural origin in this case? Again, if you could prove to me it had supernatural origins, I don't mind that. I'm okay with that. I'm not troubled by that. I would expect such things. It's what happens after the fact. A couple of things. It simply doesn't match up to what we see in the text, and also what I see people doing as a result of it. It's kind of like what happened when Moses was given the direction to make the serpent that was to be lifted up among the children of Israel, and if they looked upon it, they wouldn't die of the snake bite, and Jesus uses that in John 3:14 about as Moses lifted the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. But they ended up worshiping the thing because they looked at the miracle and ascribed the miracle to the thing rather than the God who does what he does. So it's a distraction, it's a side thing, and it's only meant to put the focus someplace where it's not supposed to be. So again, I don't make the case against the Shroud of Turin because of all the scientific or non-scientific or all of that end of the inquiry where people like to argue all of that kind of stuff. I'll stipulate that it may have just incredible properties about it that some people would say it couldn't have been made. It couldn't have been manufactured. It couldn't have been the work of someone's hands. It couldn't have been any of that stuff. Fine. If that stuff is conclusive and it has no way of being created by man and it's something more supernatural, fine with that. The problem is that the image doesn't really fit the narrative that we have in the text of what happened to him personally, and John's account isn't what we would find in the shroud. This is one piece, and again, the idea that if he had a head covering and everything else, that would have obscured, the blood would have not been in the nice clean, the clean droplets, it would have been smudged all over his face. And same thing with the rest of the body. So it just doesn't fit. John's description doesn't fit at all what we see in the shroud. So I've never really thought of it as being an authentic thing. Some people like to say that it is, whatever. People can believe what they want to believe, but I just don't think that it measures up to what we see in the text. So let me know what you think. Love to get your impressions on that. You can leave your comments in the video if you'd like, or you can send me your inquiries or questions over the ministry's website through the email that is found there, and that is oldpaththeology.net. And I'd love to hear from you either way, and I'd love to discuss these things. I'm not really much into a debate type of a thing. We can go round and round maybe one or two times, but I kind of get to the point where that gets a little bit old and try to bring it to a halt. So with all that said, again, we will pick up at chapter 26 next week in Isaiah, and we'll continue doing our apologetic things as we look at very interesting things throughout history and things that pertain to the church. So